You face obstacles that seem insurmountable, and with each setback, you feel your confidence cracking under the weight of repeated defeats. Every challenge appears larger than your ability to overcome it, while you watch others push through similar barriers with unwavering determination and emerge victorious. I am Napoleon Bonaparte, the leader who rose from a minor Corsican artillery officer to Emperor of France, conquering most of Europe through sheer force of will and strategic audacity. What I discovered about conquering obstacles will transform how you approach every challenge in your life, giving you the mindset to act as if victory is inevitable even when defeat seems certain. The same principles that helped me overcome the seemingly impossible, from political exile to military disadvantages to social barriers, can help you conquer whatever stands between you and your greatest ambitions. But first, like this video, subscribe for more imperial wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to learn the art of conquest. Let me tell you something about obstacles that most people refuse to accept. They are not barriers to your greatness. They are the very foundation upon which greatness is built. I know this because I lived it, breathed it, and conquered through it every single day of my rise from a nobody to the Emperor of France. I was born on the island of Corsica just 1 year after France acquired it from Genoa. Do you understand what this meant? I was neither truly Corsican nor truly French. I belonged nowhere completely, accepted nowhere fully. When I arrived at the military academy in mainland France at age 9, I spoke French with such a thick Corsican accent that my classmates mocked me relentlessly. They called me names, excluded me from their groups, and treated me like the foreign curiosity I appeared to be. Most children would have been crushed by this treatment. Most would have tried to hide their origins, soften their accent, and blend into the background. But I chose a different path entirely. I decided to act as if my differences were advantages, not disadvantages. I began to speak louder, not softer. I argued with my instructors when I disagreed, not because I was disrespectful, but because I refused to let anyone silence the fire burning inside me. The other boys saw my passion for learning as odd, my intensity as dangerous. While they played games, I devoured books on military history, mathematics, and geography. While they formed social circles, I formed strategies. I acted as if knowledge was power, and it was. By the time I graduated, I had transformed from the mocked outsider into the student they grudgingly respected and secretly feared. But the real test came when I received my commission as a second lieutenant in the artillery. Here I was, a 20-year-old Corsican commanding French soldiers who questioned my every order because of my accent and appearance. The obstacles seemed insurmountable. How could I lead men who saw me as foreign and inferior? I made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I chose to act as if I had already earned their respect, as if my authority was unquestionable, as if my vision was so compelling that following me was their privilege, not my desperate hope. When I walked into that first meeting with my men, I didn't apologize for my accent or my youth. I spoke with such conviction about our mission, such clarity about our objectives, and such confidence in our inevitable success that something extraordinary happened. They began to believe it too. Within months, my artillery unit became known for precision, discipline, and results that exceeded every expectation. Not because I had superior equipment or more experienced soldiers, but because I had acted my way into the reality I envisioned. I had conquered the obstacle of acceptance by refusing to accept that it was an obstacle at all. The moment everything changed for me came during the siege of Toulon. The city had fallen to the British, and the French forces were in disarray. I was still just a captain, invisible among the higher-ranking officers who were failing to retake this crucial port. But I saw something. They misstand opportunity, hidden within the chaos. I approached the commanding officers with a plan so audacious that it bordered on madness. I proposed to position our artillery in a location that conventional wisdom said was impossible to reach and too dangerous to hold. But I had calculated the angles, studied the terrain, and visualized the victory. More importantly, I acted as if this plan was not just possible, but inevitable. They gave me the chance. Perhaps because they had run out of conventional options. When my artillery barrage began from that impossible position, it created panic in the British lines and opened the path for our forces to retake Toulon. In a single stroke, I had transformed from an unknown captain to the hero of Toulon. But the real victory wasn't tactical, it was psychological. I had proven to myself that acting as if the impossible was possible could literally make it so. That night, as I looked out over the recaptured city, I realized something profound. Every obstacle is an invitation to think differently, to act boldly, and to become more than you were before facing it. The British occupation of Toulon wasn't a problem to be solved, it was an opportunity to be seized. My foreign origins weren't a disadvantage. To overcome, they were a unique perspective to leverage. From that moment forward, I never saw another obstacle the same way. When faced with superior enemy numbers, I acted as if I had the advantage and found ways to make it true. When confronted with political opposition, I acted as if I had already won and maneuvered until I had. When challenged by those who questioned my right to rule, I acted as if my authority came from a higher source than their approval, and eventually, it did. This is what I want you to understand. The obstacles you face today are not punishments from the universe or evidence of your inadequacy. They are opportunities disguised as problems, advantages disguised as disadvantages, and stepping stones disguised as barriers. But you will only see them this way if you first act as if they are. Your reality will follow your actions, just as mine did, just as every conqueror's has throughout history. There comes a moment in every conqueror's life when they stop asking for permission and start taking what they deserve. For me, that moment came not in a palace or a grand ceremony, but on a muddy battlefield at Toulon, where I learned the most important lesson of my life. Opportunity doesn't wait for you to be ready. It demands that you act as if you already are. I want you to understand something about the siege of Toulon that the history books don't capture. Yes, my artillery strategy was brilliant, but the real breakthrough wasn't tactical, it was psychological. When I walked into that command tent filled with senior officers who had been failing for weeks, I was just a 24-year-old captain with a Corsican accent and more ambition than experience. By every measure of conventional authority, I had no right to speak, let alone be heard. But here's what I discovered that changed everything. Authority isn't given, it's taken. And it's taken not through force or manipulation, but through the simple act of behaving as if you already possess it. When I unrolled my maps and began explaining my strategy, I didn't ask if I could speak, I spoke. I didn't request their attention, I commanded it. I didn't suggest they might consider my plan, I showed them why it would work. The senior officers in that tent faced a choice: continue failing with their conventional approaches, or trust the young artillery officer who spoke with absolute certainty about a plan they hadn't considered. They chose to trust me, not because of my rank or reputation, but because I acted with the confidence of someone who had already seen the victory I was describing. This is what most people misunderstand about confidence. They think it comes after success, that you earn the right to act confidently by first proving yourself. But this is backwards. In my experience, confidence must come first. You must act as if you've already achieved what you're seeking, and then reality will bend to match your actions. When I positioned our artillery at Point L'Aiguillette, I wasn't hoping it would work. I was executing a plan I had already seen succeed in my mind. When I calculated the angles of fire, I wasn't guessing, I was applying mathematical certainties to a situation others saw as chaos. When I gave orders to my gun crews, I wasn't requesting their cooperation, I was directing their participation. In our inevitable victory, the British had held Toulon for months because everyone before me had approached the siege conventionally. They attacked where attacks were expected, positioned artillery where it was safe, and fought the battle the enemy wanted them to fight. But I had learned something crucial. When you act as if conventional limitations don't apply to you, you discover they often don't. The position I chose for our guns was considered impossible to reach and too exposed to hold. But impossible and too exposed are just opinions, not facts. I acted as if that position was not only possible, but ideal, and through sheer force of will and careful planning, I made it so. When our cannons opened fire from that unexpected angle, the British defences crumbled not just because of superior positioning, but because I had acted with such certainty that my men never doubted we would succeed. That night, as I watched Toulon burn in the distance, our victory fire, not their resistance, I realized I had crossed a threshold I could never uncross. I was no longer the young officer hoping for recognition. I was the man who had seized an opportunity others couldn't see and transformed it into triumph. The obstacle of British occupation hadn't stopped me. It had revealed me, but the most important lesson came in the aftermath. Suddenly, the same officers who had barely acknowledged my existence were seeking my counsel. The same military establishment that had seen me as an outsider was now hailing me as a hero. My promotion to Brigadier General came not because I had gradually earned their respect, but because I had acted with such authority that they had no choice but to recognize it. This taught me something profound about how the world really works. People don't follow you because you have authority. You have authority because people follow you, and people follow those who act as if they're worth following. The moment you start behaving like someone whose ideas matter, whose plans will succeed, and whose leadership will lead to victory, others begin to see you that way too. From Toulon forward, I never again waited for permission to act on my convictions. When I saw an opportunity, I seized it. When I encountered an obstacle, I treated it as a puzzle to be solved, not a barrier to accept. When others said something was impossible, I acted as if they simply lacked imagination. This is the revelation I want you to grasp. The obstacles in your life are not testing your worthiness. They are revealing your power. Every challenge you face is an opportunity to demonstrate to yourself and others that you are capable of more than they imagined. But this only happens when you first act as if it's true. Stop waiting for the world to give you permission to be great. Stop hoping that someone will recognize your potential and invite you to fulfill it. Instead, identify the opportunity hidden within your current obstacle. Develop a plan to seize it, and then act with such conviction that others have no choice but to follow your lead. The artillery officer who walked into that command tent at Toulon was the same person who had been ignored for months. But the man who emerged was someone entirely different, not because his circumstances had changed, but because he had acted his way into a new reality. Your transformation awaits the same decisive action. After Toulon, something fundamental shifted in how I saw the world. I had tasted what it meant to act as if victory was inevitable, and I could never return to the mindset of someone who merely hoped for success. I had discovered the mind of a conqueror, and once you think like a conqueror, every obstacle becomes a stepping stone to greater triumph. Most people spend their lives in survival mode, asking themselves, how can I avoid failure? But conquerors ask an entirely different question. How can I turn this situation into victory? This shift in thinking from defensive to offensive, from reactive to proactive, from surviving to conquering changes everything about how you encounter obstacles. Let me share with you the mental transformation that took place within me after my promotion to Brigadier General. Suddenly, I found myself in rooms with men who had decades more experience, family connections that spanned generations, and resources I could barely imagine. The conventional wisdom would have been to listen more than I spoke, to learn the established ways, to gradually earn my place among them. Instead, I chose to act as if I belonged, not just among them, but above them, not out of arrogance, but out of a deeper understanding of how power actually works. I had learned that in any room, there are those who see problems and those who see possibilities, those who follow established patterns and those who create new ones, those who accept the current reality and those who bend reality to their will. When I entered my first strategic planning session as a general, I was surrounded by men discussing defensive positions, protective strategies, and ways to minimize losses. They were thinking like people who didn't want to lose. But I had trained my mind to think like someone who intended to win. And winning requires a completely different mental framework. I began to speak about offensive operations, about seizing territory rather than defending it, about creating opportunities rather than waiting for them. The room fell silent, not because my ideas were wrong, but because they recognized a fundamentally different way of thinking about warfare. I was acting as if victory was not just possible, but inevitable, and this certainty was contagious. This is what I discovered about the conqueror's mind. It doesn't just see opportunities where others see obstacles. It creates opportunities from obstacles. When faced with a mountain, most people see an impassable barrier. A conqueror sees a fortress. When confronted with an enemy army, most people see a threat. A conqueror sees a chance to demonstrate superiority. When challenged by limited resources, most people see scarcity. A conqueror sees a test of creativity. The transformation from survivor to conqueror begins with a simple but profound decision. You must act as if you've already won. This doesn't mean becoming reckless or ignoring real dangers. It means approaching every situation from a position of mental strength rather than mental weakness. It means asking, how will I conquer this? Instead of, how will I survive this? Remember the exact moment when this mindset crystallized for me. I was studying maps of Italy, planning campaigns that my superiors considered wildly ambitious. The conventional approach would have been to secure our current positions, maybe advance slowly and cautiously. But as I stared at those maps, I didn't see defensive positions. I saw an empire waiting to be conquered. I began to trace my finger across territories that belonged to Austria, to various Italian states, to forces much larger and more established than ours. But in my mind, I wasn't planning to fight them, I was planning to defeat them. I wasn't hoping to gain ground. I was deciding which cities would surrender first. I wasn't preparing for battle, I was choreographing victory. This is the crucial distinction. Acting as if you can conquer any obstacle means you approach challenges from the end result backward, not from your current position forward. You start with the victory you intend to achieve and work backwards to determine what steps will make it inevitable. Most people start with their current limitations and work forward to see what might be possible. Conquerors reverse this process entirely. When I finally received command of the army of Italy, I walked into a situation that would have overwhelmed most generals. The troops were demoralized, undersupplied, and outnumbered by enemy forces that controlled superior positions. The logical response would have been to focus on improving morale, securing supplies, and finding defensive positions to hold until reinforcements arrived. Instead, I gathered my officers and spoke to them as if we were already victorious. I described the territories we would capture, the enemies we would defeat, and the glory we would win. I acted with such certainty about our coming triumphs that they began to see themselves not as the leaders of a struggling army, but as the commanders of a conquering force. Within weeks, we had won battles that military experts had deemed impossible, not because we had better equipment or more soldiers, but because we had approached each engagement with the mindset of conquerors rather than defenders. We acted as if defeat was inconceivable, and this psychological advantage proved more powerful than any tactical superiority. The mind of a conqueror operates on a simple principle. What you consistently act as if is true becomes true. If you act as if obstacles are opportunities, they become opportunities. If you act as if you're destined for greatness, you begin moving toward greatness. If you act as if victory is inevitable, you start making choices that make victory inevitable. But here's what most people miss. This isn't about positive thinking or wishful hoping. This is about fundamental rewiring of how you process challenges. A conqueror's mind doesn't deny the existence of obstacles, refuses to accept them as permanent or insurmountable. It sees every barrier as temporary, every setback as set up for a comeback, every limitation as an invitation to innovate. This mental transformation doesn't happen overnight, but it begins with a single decision. Today, you will start acting as if you can conquer any obstacle you face. Not someday when you're more prepared, not eventually when circumstances improve, but right now with whatever resources and capabilities you currently possess. The conqueror's mind is not a gift bestowed upon a chosen few, it's a choice available to anyone willing to think differently about what's possible. The question isn't whether you're capable of developing this mindset. The question is whether you're ready to stop thinking like someone who hopes to survive and start thinking like someone who intends to conquer. Sometimes the greatest obstacles come disguised as opportunities, and sometimes the greatest opportunities emerge from what appears to be complete disaster. My Egyptian campaign taught me this lesson in the most brutal way possible, and it became the foundation for one of the most important principles of conquest. When the world abandons you, you must act as if you've finally been set free. The Egyptian expedition began as a strategic matter. While the Directory in Paris worried about my growing popularity after the Italian victories, I proposed a campaign that would disrupt British trade routes to India, establish French presence in the East, and remove me from the political tensions of Paris. It seemed perfect for everyone involved, till it became a catastrophe that would have destroyed any leader who didn't understand how to transform disaster into opportunity. The plan required naval support from our fleet, but Admiral Nelson had other ideas. In a devastating night attack at the Battle of the Nile, the British destroyed most of our ships, leaving my army of 35,000 men stranded in Egypt with no way home and no hope of reinforcement. In conventional terms, we were finished, cut off from France, surrounded by hostile forces, and abandoned by our own navy. Most commanders would have seen this as the end of their career and the doom of their men. I chose to see it as liberation from limitations I hadn't even realized were holding me back. When you act as if disaster is actually opportunity, you begin to discover possibilities that would never have appeared under normal circumstances. I gathered my officers the morning after we received news of our naval defeat. They expected me to announce a desperate defensive strategy or perhaps begin planning a futile march toward the coast. Instead, I unrolled maps of the entire region and began explaining how we were going to conquer Egypt, not just survive in it. Gentlemen, I told them, we came here as an expeditionary force. We will leave as the builders of an empire. Their faces showed a mixture of confusion and concern, but I continued with absolute conviction. We are no longer constrained by orders from Paris or limited by what our ships can supply. We are now free to create our own destiny in the land of the pharaohs. This is the crucial mindset shift. When external support disappears, you must act as if you've been given complete authority to achieve what you came to accomplish. Instead of feeling abandoned, I felt empowered. Instead of seeing isolation as weakness, I saw it as strength. Instead of viewing our situation as hopeless, I began to see it as unprecedented opportunity. We couldn't retreat, so we would advance. We couldn't receive supplies, so we would take them. We couldn't rely on naval power, so we would become a land-based empire. Every limitation became a liberation. Every obstacle became an innovation opportunity. Every disaster became a chance to demonstrate that conquerors don't need ideal conditions. They create them. The key was maintaining absolute confidence in front of my troops, while privately developing strategies to turn our disadvantages into advantages. I organized the army not as refugees hoping for rescue, but as conquerors claiming new territory. I spoke to them not about survival, but about glory. I planned not defensive positions, but offensive campaigns. When we marched toward Cairo, I didn't present it as a desperate gamble by stranded soldiers. I framed it as the next phase of our imperial expansion. When we faced the Mamluk cavalry warriors who had dominated this region for centuries, I didn't prepare my men for a difficult fight. I prepared them for inevitable victory over an outdated military system. The Battle of the Pyramids became one of our greatest triumphs, precisely because we approached it as conquerors, not as desperate men fighting for survival. Standing in the shadow of those ancient monuments, I told my soldiers, from the height of these pyramids, 40 centuries looked down upon you. I wasn't trying to intimidate them with the weight of history. I was inspiring them to add their names to it. But the real test of acting as if disaster is opportunity came during the siege of Acre. This fortress city represented our gateway to further conquest in Syria, but it was heavily fortified and defended by experienced Ottoman forces supported by British naval power. After weeks of siege, with casualties mounting and supplies dwindling, many of my officers began suggesting retreat. I refused to even consider it. Not out of stubbornness, but because I had trained myself to act as if setbacks were simply puzzles, waiting to be solved. Every failed assault taught us something about the enemy's weaknesses. Every day of siege wore down their supplies as much as ours. Every casualty we suffered was matched by casualties they couldn't afford. More importantly, I used the siege to demonstrate to my army what it meant to act as if victory was inevitable, even when circumstances suggested otherwise. I walked among the troops daily, not as a commander worried about failure, but as a leader absolutely certain of eventual success. I spoke about what we would do after we took Acre, not if we took it. When disease struck our ranks, I acted as if this was simply another challenge to overcome, not a reason to abandon our objectives. When ammunition ran low, I acted as if this was an opportunity to demonstrate our tactical superiority, not a cause for retreat. When the siege dragged on longer than expected, I acted as if patience was our strategic advantage, not a sign of failing leadership. Eventually, we did withdraw from Acre, but by then I had taught my army something more valuable than any single victory: how to maintain the psychology of conquerors, even in the face of apparent defeat. We left Acre not as a broken force retreating in failure, but as an army that had demonstrated its power, and chose to redirect that power toward more promising objectives. The Egyptian campaign ultimately ended when I returned to France to seize political power, leaving my army under capable command. But the lessons I learned in that desert became the foundation for everything I would accomplish afterward. I had proven to myself that when the world abandons you, when conventional support disappears, when you're cut off from everything you thought you needed, that's precisely when you discover what you're truly capable of achieving. Acting as if disaster is opportunity isn't about denying reality or ignoring genuine difficulties. It's about refusing to let circumstances determine your mindset. It's about maintaining the psychology of a conqueror especially when conquest seems impossible. Because that's exactly when the greatest conquests become possible. There is a moment in every great conquest when time itself becomes your ally, but only if you've learned to act as if perfect timing is something you create, not something you wait for. The Battle of Austerlitz taught me that the art of impossible timing isn't about luck or chance. It's about engineering circumstances so precisely that when you finally strike, victory appears inevitable to everyone watching. December 2nd, 1805, was supposed to be the day I was crushed by the combined might of Austria and Russia. Emperor Francis of Austria and Tsar Alexander of Russia had assembled nearly 90,000 troops on the high ground near Austerlitz, while I commanded only 75,000 men positioned in what appeared to be a disadvantageous valley. Every military expert who analyzed the situation concluded that Napoleon Bonaparte was about to meet his Waterloo 25 years before Waterloo, but they didn't understand what I had learned about timing. The moment when you appear most vulnerable is often the perfect moment to strike your decisive blow. I had spent weeks acting as if I was retreating, as if I was avoiding battle, as if I was desperately seeking negotiations to avoid the confrontation everyone knew was coming. This wasn't cowardice, it was choreography. You see, true conquerors don't wait for perfect timing. They create it by manipulating their enemies' perceptions and desires. I had studied the psychology of the Austrian and Russian commanders, and I knew they were eager for a glorious victory that would crush the upstart Corsican once and for all. Their eagerness would become their weakness, but only if I could make them believe they had already won before the battle began. I deliberately weakened my right flank, abandoning the strategic heights of Pratzen Plateau and making it appear as if I was preparing a desperate retreat. I sent envoys to both emperors, suggesting I might be willing to negotiate a surrender. I allowed reconnaissance parties to observe preparations that looked like the frantic arrangements of a doomed army. Every action was designed to convince them that tomorrow would bring their easy triumph. But while I appeared to be acting out of desperation, I was actually acting out of supreme confidence in a plan they couldn't see. I had positioned my forces not for retreat, but for the perfect counterattack. I had timed every movement not for escape, but for the moment when their overconfidence would create the exact opportunity I needed. The key to impossible timing is this: you must act as if you can see several moves ahead while your opponents are focused only on the current position. While they were planning how to crush my army, I was planning how to use their attack to destroy theirs. While they were positioning for what they thought would be their victory, I was positioning for what I knew would be mine. The night before the battle, I walked among my troops, not as a general who hoped to survive tomorrow, but as an emperor who was about to demonstrate his mastery. I spoke to them with such certainty about the coming victory that their confidence became unshakable. When soldiers see their commander acting as if defeat is impossible, they begin to fight as if victory is inevitable. At sunrise, everything unfolded exactly as I had foreseen. The Allied forces attacked my weakened right flank, believing they were exploiting my desperate miscalculation. They rushed down from their superior positions on the Pratzen Plateau, eager to deliver what they thought would be the killing blow. They moved with the enthusiasm of hunters who believed they had cornered their prey, but I had been waiting for this moment for weeks. The instant they abandoned the high ground to pursue what they thought was my retreating army, I launched my hidden reserves directly at the Pratzen Plateau they had just vacated. While they were chasing shadows in the valley, I was seizing the commanding position they had foolishly abandoned. The beauty of perfect timing isn't just about when you act, it's about creating the conditions that make your action irresistible. By the time the Allied commanders realized they had been deceived, my forces held the high ground. Their army was divided and confused, and what they thought would be their moment of triumph had become their moment of catastrophe. The battle that was supposed to end my career instead established my dominance over continental Europe. In a single day, I had broken the Third Coalition, secured my position as emperor, and demonstrated that impossible timing isn't about luck, it's about acting with such foresight and patience that when the perfect moment arrives, you're the only one prepared to seize it. This is what I want you to understand about timing in your own conquests. Most people act too early out of impatience or too late out of fear. Conquerors act at the precise moment when their action will have maximum impact, and they create that moment through careful preparation and psychological manipulation of the circumstances around them. Learning to master impossible timing means developing the ability to act as if you can control not just your own actions, but the reactions of everyone around you. It means understanding that apparent weakness can become actual strength, that strategic retreat can position you for decisive advance, and that allowing others to think they're winning can set them up for total defeat. The principles I used at Austerlitz apply to any competitive situation you'll face. Whether you're positioning for a promotion, launching a business venture, or confronting any significant challenge, the art of impossible timing remains the same. Create circumstances that make your opponents overconfident, position yourself for the perfect countermove, and then strike with such precision that your victory appears inevitable to everyone watching. But remember, this level of tactical sophistication only works if you first act as if you can see the entire game board. While others are focused on individual pieces, you must think several moves ahead, plan for multiple contingencies, and maintain absolute confidence in your strategy especially when others believe you're about to fail. The morning after Austerlitz, as I watched the shattered remains of two great armies retreating across the frozen landscape, I realized I had mastered something more valuable than any single victory: the ability to make time itself serve my purposes. From that day forward, I never again waited for the right moment, created it. There are moments when you must choose between the impossible and the unthinkable. In May of 1800, I faced such a choice. Accept defeat in Italy or march 40,000 men across the Alps in the dead of winter to attack an enemy who believed they were completely safe from assault. I chose the impossible, and in doing so, I learned that acting as if natural barriers don't exist is the first step to making them irrelevant. The situation in Italy had become desperate while I was consolidating power in France. Austrian forces had recaptured most of the territory I had won in my previous campaigns, and they controlled all the traditional invasion routes. They sat behind their fortifications, confident that geography itself protected them. The Alps formed an impassable wall between my army and my objectives, or so everyone believed. But I had developed a different relationship with the impossible. Where others saw insurmountable barriers, I saw opportunities to achieve surprise so complete that victory would be assured before the first shot was fired. The Austrians expected me to attack through the traditional passes, if I attacked at all. They had positioned their forces to defend against conventional approaches. They had not prepared for an army that would appear as if by magic in their readopt. The decision to cross the Alps wasn't born from desperation, it was born from the understanding that impossible actions often succeed precisely because they seem impossible to everyone else. When you act as if conventional limitations don't apply to you, you discover that many of those limitations exist only in people's minds, not in physical reality. I announced my intention to march the army across the Great St. Bernard Pass to my officers during a planning session that has become legendary, though not for the reasons most people imagine. The maps spread across the table showed terrain that had defeated armies for centuries: snow-covered peaks, narrow trails that dropped into impossible chasms, and weather conditions that could kill a man in minutes. My marshals looked at these maps and saw death for our army. I looked at the same maps and saw a highway to victory that no enemy would ever expect us to use. This is the crucial difference between acting as if something is impossible and acting as if it's merely difficult. Difficult problems just have to be willing to pay the price to implement them. Gentlemen, I told them, the word impossible is not French. This wasn't a clever phrase designed to inspire them. It was a statement of fact about how conquerors must think. That moment you accept that something is truly impossible, you stop looking for ways to achieve it. But when you act as if impossible is just another word for not yet accomplished, you begin to discover methods that no one else has considered. The logistics of moving 40,000 men, their equipment, artillery, and supplies across mountain peaks. In May, snowstorms required more than conventional military planning. It required acting as if the laws of physics were suggestions rather than absolutes. We disassembled our cannons and carried them piece by piece. We carved footholds in ice for men and animals. We created rope systems to lift equipment up cliff faces that maps said were unclimbable. But the real challenge wasn't physical, it was psychological. An army facing the impossible must believe that their leader has already seen their path to victory, even when that path leads through terrain that looks like certain death. Every morning as we climbed higher into those mountains, I had to act with such confidence about our destination that 40,000 men would follow me deeper into what appeared to be a frozen hell. I rode among the troops daily, not as a general who hoped we would survive this ordeal, but as an emperor who was leading them to the greatest victory of their careers. When the wind cut through our ranks like knives, I spoke about the warmth of victory waiting for us in Italy. When the altitude made breathing difficult, I talked about how icily we would breathe once we had surprised our enemies. When men began to doubt whether this passage was possible, I acted with such certainty that they stopped questioning and started following. The crossing took 6 days that tested every principle I had learned about conquering the impossible. We lost men to the cold, equipment to the chasms, and time to weather that seemed determined to stop us. But we also gained something invaluable, the absolute knowledge that we could accomplish what our enemies considered impossible. When we finally descended into the Po Valley, emerging from passes the Austrians hadn't even bothered to guard because they believed no army could use them, we achieved something more valuable than surprise. We achieved the psychological advantage of an army that had just conquered nature itself. My soldiers no longer looked at obstacles and wondered if they could overcome them. They looked at obstacles and wondered how quickly they could overcome them. The Battle of Marengo that followed was almost anticlimactic. We had already won the campaign by refusing to accept that the Alps were unconquerable. The Austrian forces, who had been preparing to defend against conventional attacks from predictable directions, found themselves facing an army that had appeared behind their positions as if by magic. Their psychological defeat was complete before the tactical battle began. But the lesson I learned in those mountains transcended military strategy. I discovered that acting as if natural barriers don't exist often makes them irrelevant. Not because the barriers disappear, but because your commitment to overcoming them makes you find ways that others never considered. The Alps didn't become easier to cross, we became more determined to cross them. This principle applies to every obstacle you'll face in your own conquests. The barriers that seem most insurmountable, lack of resources, superior competition, unfavorable circumstances, often become irrelevant when you act as if they're simply problems to be solved rather than realities to be accepted. The moment you truly commit to achieving something, regardless of the apparent obstacles, you begin to see possibilities that were invisible to you before. Most people approach challenges by first cataloging all the reasons why success might be impossible. Conquerors approach challenges by first deciding that success is inevitable, then working backward to determine what must be done to make it so. The difference isn't in their capabilities, it's in their willingness to act as if impossible is just another way of saying not yet accomplished. Standing in that Italian valley, looking back at the peaks we had just crossed, I realized that the greatest conquests aren't achieved by avoiding the impossible, they're achieved by refusing to let the impossible stop you. The Alps hadn't become less formidable, but we had become more determined. And in the end, determination always defeats geography. Power is not taken by force, it is taken by those who act as if they already possess it. The moment I placed the imperial crown upon my own head in Notre Dame Cathedral, I wasn't seizing power that belonged to others. I was claiming authority that I had already earned through the simple act of behaving as if it was already mine. This is the deepest secret of conquest. True power begins in the mind, not in the sword. December 2nd, 1804, was supposed to be the day Pope Pius VII crowned me Emperor of the French. The ceremony had been planned for months, with all the traditional protocols that would legitimize my rule in the eyes of European nobility. I would kneel before the Pope, receive the crown from his hands, and become emperor through the ancient authority of the Church. But in the moment when everything was scripted, to follow tradition, I chose to write my own rules. As I stood in that magnificent cathedral, surrounded by the most powerful people in France, I realized that accepting the crown from the Pope would mean accepting that my authority came from someone else's approval. And I had learned something fundamental about power. The moment you act as if you need permission to be great, you've already limited your greatness to what others are willing to grant you. So, I took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on my own head. Then I took the smaller crown and placed it on Josephine's head myself. In that single gesture, I demonstrated to everyone watching, including myself, that my authority came not from tradition, not from divine appointment, not from anyone's blessing, but from my own will to claim what I had earned. The gasps that echoed through Notre Dame weren't just shock at my audacity. They were the sound of people witnessing someone who had learned to act as if conventional limitations on power didn't apply to him. The Pope could have protested, the nobles could have objected, the foreign ambassadors could have walked out, but they didn't, because I had acted with such certainty, such natural authority, that opposing me in that moment would have seemed like opposing gravity itself. This is what most people misunderstand about acquiring power and authority in any situation. They think power is granted by others, by bosses, by institutions, by social conventions. But real power is claimed by those who act as if they deserve it, before anyone else recognizes that they do. The world follows those who have already decided to lead, not those who wait for permission to step forward. But let me be clear about what I mean by acting as if you possess power. This isn't about arrogance or delusion. It's about understanding that all authority is ultimately psychological. When I walked into a room of experienced generals and began giving orders, I wasn't pretending to have authority. I was exercising authority that I had already claimed through my actions, my results, and my willingness to take responsibility for outcomes. The psychology of conquest operates on a simple principle. People grant authority to those who demonstrate they can handle it. But you can't demonstrate you can handle authority until you first act as if you already have it. This creates what appears to be an impossible paradox. You need authority to get authority. The solution is to start acting with authority in small situations and gradually expand the sphere where others accept your leadership. After my coronation, I faced the challenge of ruling not just France, but creating an empire that would reshape Europe. This required more than military victories. It required convincing millions of people that a Corsican artillery officer had the natural right to govern nations, command kings, and redesign the continental order that had existed for centuries. The key was understanding that legitimacy isn't inherited diets, created through consistent demonstration of competence. Every day, I had to act as if ruling an empire was as natural to me as commanding a battery of artillery. When I met with foreign ambassadors, I didn't behave like someone who had recently acquired power and was still learning how to use it. I acted as if I had been born to rule, as if commanding nations was simply what I did. This psychological positioning became crucial when I began appointing my brothers and marshals to thrones across Europe. Joseph as King of Naples, then Spain. Louis as King of Holland, Jerome as King of Westphalia. To the old European nobility, this was scandalous commoners and soldiers being elevated to royal status. But I acted as if this was perfectly natural, as if merit mattered more than bloodline, and gradually, this revolutionary concept became accepted reality. The most important lesson I learned about the psychology of conquest is this: the moment you start acting as if you deserve something, others begin to see you as deserving it too. But this only works if your actions are backed by genuine competence and results. Acting as if you're powerful without delivering results is just performance. Acting as if you're powerful while consistently delivering extraordinary results is leadership. I instituted the Legion of Honor not just to reward military service, but to demonstrate that in my empire, merit would be recognized regardless of birth. I created the Napoleonic Code not just to organize French law, but to show that I could build lasting institutions, not just win temporary victories. I established universities, rebuilt roads, and commissioned great works of art because an emperor doesn't just conquer territory, he creates civilization. Every action was designed to reinforce the psychological reality that I wasn't just a successful general who had seized power, but a natural leader who was building something permanent and valuable. When you act as if your authority extends beyond your current position to your ultimate potential, others begin to see that potential as inevitable reality. But the deepest aspect of conquest psychology is internal. You must convince yourself before you can convince others. I spent hours each day in private study, reading history, analyzing maps, planning campaigns that existed only in my imagination. This wasn't just preparation, it was psychological conditioning. I was training my mind to think like someone whose destiny was to reshape the world. When I finally met with other emperors and kings, I didn't feel like an imposter among legitimate rulers. I felt like the most legitimate ruler at the table because my authority came from my achievements, not my ancestry. When I negotiated treaties that redrew European borders, I didn't act like someone who was lucky to have a seat at the table. I acted like someone whose vision would determine what that table looked like. This is the psychological transformation you must undergo to conquer any significant obstacle. You must act as if you're already the person who has overcome it, not as someone who hopes to overcome it, not as someone who might overcome it, but as someone who has already transcended the limitation and is now operating from that higher level. The crown I placed on my own head wasn't just a symbol of political power, it was a symbol of psychological transformation. In that moment, I wasn't Napoleon Bonaparte hoping to become emperor. I was Emperor Napoleon, acting with all the authority, confidence, and vision that the title implied. The external ceremony simply made visible the internal reality I had already created through years of acting as if my destiny was inevitable. Your own coronation moment will come when you stop asking permission to be great and start acting as if greatness is your natural state. When you stop hoping others will recognize your potential and start demonstrating the authority you've already claimed. When you stop waiting for the right moment to seize power and start exercising the power you already possess. The psychology of conquest isn't about dominating others. It's about mastering yourself so completely that others naturally recognize your leadership. Power doesn't corrupt those who understand this principle. It reveals who they truly are when they finally stop pretending to be less than they're capable of becoming. The greatest victories are won not by defeating your enemies, but by transforming them into the very forces that propel you toward triumph. After the Battle of Austerlitz, I stood over the shattered Austrian Empire and faced a choice that would define my understanding of true conquest. I could humiliate my defeated enemies, or I could act as if their opposition had been exactly what I needed to demonstrate my superiority. Emperor Francis of Austria knelt before me in defeat, his armies scattered, his alliance broken, his empire at my mercy. The traditional approach would have been to extract maximum punishment, seize territory, demand crushing reparations, reduce Austria to a powerless shell. My generals expected this, my soldiers had earned this, and European politics justified this. But I had learned something more sophisticated about power. Enemies who become allies are more valuable than enemies who remain enemies. Instead of destroying Austria, I chose to act as if their resistance had served my greater purpose. I treated Emperor Francis not as a defeated rival, but as a fellow monarch who had simply chosen the wrong side in a conflict that was now resolved. I demanded reasonable terms, not punitive ones. I spoke of future cooperation, not past grievances. I acted as if Austria's opposition had been a necessary test of my strength, and now that the test was complete, we could proceed as partners. This wasn't mercy, it was strategy based on a deeper understanding of how obstacles can become advantages. Every enemy who opposes you gives you the opportunity to demonstrate your superiority. Every challenge they present forces you to develop capabilities you wouldn't have needed otherwise. Every conflict they create provides a stage where you can display the very qualities that will make others want to join you rather than fight you. Within months, Austria became one of my most reliable allies, and Emperor Francis gave me his daughter Marie-Louise in marriage. The empire that had organized European resistance against me became the foundation of European acceptance of my rule. What had been my greatest obstacle became my greatest validation. But this transformation only happened because I acted as if their opposition had always been destined to serve my larger purposes. The principle extends far beyond international relations. In every competitive situation I encountered, I learned to look for the hidden advantages within apparent disadvantages. When the British imposed their naval blockade to strangle French trade, I could have seen this as an insurmountable economic obstacle. Instead, I acted as if they had given me the perfect opportunity to demonstrate French self-sufficiency and innovation. I instituted the continental system, which closed European markets to British goods and forced European innovation in manufacturing and agriculture. What Britain intended as economic warfare became economic liberation for the continent. Their blockade didn't weaken us, made us stronger by forcing us to develop capabilities we had previously imported. I turned their strategy against them by acting as if their opposition was exactly what we needed to achieve true independence. This is the sophisticated mindset shift that separates true conquerors from mere survivors. Instead of asking, how can I overcome this opposition? Start asking, how can I use this opposition to become stronger than I was before? Instead of seeing enemies as problems to be eliminated, see them as opportunities to demonstrate capabilities that wouldn't be visible without their challenge. When the Third Coalition formed against me, Britain, Austria, Russia, and Sweden uniting to destroy my empire, I could have been overwhelmed by the scale of opposition I faced. Instead, I acted as if they had given me the perfect stage to demonstrate that one nation, properly led, could defeat the combined might of the old European order. Their coalition didn't represent my doom. It represented my opportunity to prove that merit could triumph over tradition. The key is understanding that every opponent who challenges you is involuntarily helping you in three crucial ways. They're forcing you to develop skills you wouldn't need in peacetime. They're providing you with opportunities to demonstrate your superiority to neutral observers, and they're revealing their own weaknesses through their attacks on your strengths. When critics attack your methods, they're actually advertising your willingness to innovate. When competitors try to copy your strategies, they're validating your leadership in the field. When enemies unite against you, they're demonstrating that you've become powerful enough to require their combined attention. Each form of opposition, when properly understood, becomes evidence of your growing influence and effectiveness. But transforming enemies into advantages requires more than just clever reframing. It requires acting with such superiority that opponents eventually recognize. They're better served by joining you than fighting you. This means maintaining honor in victory, showing respect for worthy opponents, and demonstrating that those who ally with you gain more than those who resist you. After Jan Ostedt crushed Prussian military power, I could have dismantled Prussia entirely. Instead, I acted as if their famous military system was valuable enough to preserve under my guidance. I reduced their territory but maintained their state structure, reformed their administration along French lines, and eventually welcomed them back as partners in European reorganization. The Prussia that emerged from this process was stronger and more efficient than the one that had opposed me. This approach created a psychological dynamic where defeating me became less attractive than joining me. When potential enemies looked at how I treated former opponents, they saw that resistance led to honorable defeat, followed by partnership, while alliance led to immediate benefits and enhanced status. I was teaching Europe that opposing Napoleon was temporary, but serving with Napoleon was permanent advancement. The ultimate expression of turning enemies into advantages came through the very resistance they provided. Every coalition that formed against me forced me to develop more sophisticated strategies, build more efficient administrative systems, and create more inspiring leadership techniques. My enemies were inadvertently training me to become exactly the kind of leader who could unite Europe under a single vision. When you truly understand this principle, you stop fearing opposition and start recognizing it as the highest form of flattery. Your enemies are announcing to the world that you've become significant enough to require their attention. Your critics are admitting that your methods are effective enough to threaten their position. Your competitors are acknowledging that your success is substantial enough to merit their response. The moment you start acting as if opposition is opportunity, everything changes. You stop wasting energy trying to eliminate resistance and start investing energy in leveraging resistance. You stop seeing enemies as obstacles and start seeing them as inadvertent partners in your development. You stop trying to avoid conflict and start using conflict to demonstrate exactly why others should choose to support you instead. True conquest isn't measured by territories seized or enemies defeated. It's measured by the systems you create that outlast your personal reign. While my contemporaries focused on winning battles, I learned to act as if my real purpose was to build frameworks that would function long after I was gone. The Code, Napoleon, became proof that creating order from chaos is the highest form of conquest, because it transforms temporary victories into permanent civilization. When I seized power in France, I inherited a nation that had torn itself apart through revolution. The old legal system had been destroyed, but nothing coherent had replaced it. Different regions operated under different laws, courts contradicted each other daily, and citizens had no reliable framework for conducting business, marriage, property, ownership, or any other fundamental aspect of civilized life. France was politically unified but legally chaotic. Most leaders would have seen this as an administrative headache to be managed by experts and bureaucrats. I saw it as the greatest opportunity of my career, the chance to create a legal system from scratch, based on merit and logic, rather than tradition and privilege. I acted as if this legal chaos was exactly what I needed to demonstrate that true leadership means building systems, not just winning conflicts. I personally participated in 36 of the 87 sessions where the code was debated and drafted. Picture this: the Emperor of France, fresh from military campaigns that had redefined European borders, sitting in a room with lawyers and scholars, arguing about the precise wording of laws governing inheritance, marriage contracts, and property rights. My marshals thought I was wasting time that could be spent planning the next campaign. I knew I was investing time in something more valuable than any military victory. This is the crucial insight about systematic conquest. While others are fighting today's battles, you must be building tomorrow's foundations. acting as if temporary. Wins matter less than permanent institutions means accepting short-term opportunity costs for long-term transformation. Most people can't make this trade-off because they can't act as if their legacy matters more than their immediate gratification. The Code Napoleon established principles that seem obvious now but were revolutionary then. Equality before the law, regardless of birth, protection of property rights, civil marriage, divorce under specific circumstances, and merit-based advancement in legal careers. I wasn't just writing laws, I was encoding a philosophy of how society should function when it's organized around capability rather than aristocracy. But the real power of the code wasn't in its individual provisions, it was in its systematic coherence. Every law connected logically to every other law. Every principle reinforced the overall framework. Every section served the larger purpose of creating a society where individual merit could flourish within stable institutions. I had acted as if it was possible to engineer an entire social system, and then I had actually done it. The impact extended far beyond France's borders. As my armies conquered territory across Europe, I didn't just impose French political control, I introduced the Code Napoleon as the legal foundation for modern governance. Spain, Italy, Germany, Poland, and dozens of other regions experienced their first taste of systematic legal equality. I was conquering not just with soldiers, but with superior ideas about how civilization should function. This taught me something profound about influence and power. The systems you create have more lasting impact than the battles you win. Military victories establish what you can take. Legal and institutional frameworks establish what you can build. The former proves your strength. The latter proves your vision. And vision always outlasts strength. When I established the University of France, I applied the same systematic approach to education. Instead of allowing each region to educate its children according to local traditions and prejudices, I created a unified curriculum that would produce citizens capable of participating in a merit-based society. I acted as if education was too important to be left to chance, tradition, or local preferences. The university system I created emphasized mathematics, science, literature, and history subjects that develop rational thinking rather than just social compliance. I wanted to produce engineers, administrators, officers, and leaders who could maintain and expand the systems I was building. I was thinking beyond my own lifetime, acting as if my real responsibility was to create institutions that would continue improving society long after I was gone. The same systematic thinking shaped my approach to infrastructure. I commissioned the building of roads, bridges, canals, and public buildings not just because they served immediate military or economic needs, but because I was acting as if permanent infrastructure was more valuable than temporary conquest. The roads I built carried my armies during wartime, but they carried commerce and communication for generations afterward. Every system I created was designed to reinforce every other system. Legal equality supported educational merit, which produced capable administrators who maintained efficient infrastructure, which enabled economic growth, which funded military strength, which protected the entire framework from external threats. I had learned to think systematically about power, not just how to acquire it, but how to institutionalize it. This systematic approach created something unprecedented in European history, a society where your birth determined your starting point, but your abilities determined your destination. The Code Napoleon made it legally impossible for aristocratic privilege to override individual merit. The educational system ensured that talent could be identified and developed regardless of social origin. The infrastructure provided opportunities for that talent to create value for society. But the most important aspect of systematic conquest is this: systems that work become models for everyone else. The code, Napoleon, spread across Europe, not through military force alone, but through voluntary adoption by societies that recognized its superiority to their existing legal frameworks. I had conquered not just through strength, but through providing better solutions to universal human needs. When you learn to act as if building systems is more important than winning individual confrontations, you develop a completely different relationship with obstacles and opportunities. Every challenge becomes a chance to demonstrate the superiority of your systematic approach. Every victory becomes an opportunity to extend your systems into new areas. Every setback becomes feedback for improving your frameworks. The code, Napoleon, still influences legal systems worldwide more than 2 centuries after its creation. The educational principles I established still shape how societies develop human potential. The infrastructure I commissioned still carries traffic and commerce. These systems have conquered more territory and influenced more lives than my armies ever did, precisely because they were designed to survive and spread based on their merit, not on my personal power. This is the ultimate lesson of systematic conquest. When you act as if your real purpose is to create value that outlasts your personal ambitions, you achieve a form of immortality that no military victory can provide. You become not just someone who seized power, but someone who built civilization. And civilization always conquers chaos, given enough time and systematic effort. The ultimate test of any conqueror comes not in their greatest triumphs, but in their response to absolute defeat. When I was exiled to the island of Elba in 1814, stripped of my empire, abandoned by my marshals, and declared a fallen tyrant by all of Europe, I faced a choice that defines every person who has ever been knocked down: accept defeat as final, or act as if defeat is simply the setup for the greatest. Comeback in history. Elba was supposed to be my prison disguised as a kingdom, a tiny Mediterranean island with 12,000 inhabitants, where the former emperor of Europe would fade into irrelevance, while the Bourbon monarchy restored the old order in France. The Allied powers had designed my exile perfectly close enough to France to prevent me from claiming I had been murdered, far enough to prevent me from influencing French politics, small enough to contain my ambitions, comfortable enough to prevent sympathy for my situation. But they made one crucial miscalculation. They assumed that a man who had spent his entire life acting as if the impossible was merely difficult would suddenly start accepting limitations as permanent. They thought exile would break my spirit. Instead, it clarified my purpose. When you've lost everything external, you discover what remains internal. And what remained in me was the unshakable conviction that my story was far from over. I spent my first weeks on Elba acting as if this was a temporary, administrative posting rather than permanent exile. I reorganized the island's government, improved its roads, redesigned its defenses, and treated my 600-man Imperial Guard as if they were the advance unit of a force that would soon be much larger. The local population, expecting a broken man consumed with self-pity, instead found an emperor who governed their island more effectively than any ruler in their history. This wasn't denial or delusion. It was strategic psychology. Every day I spent acting as if my exile was temporary made it more likely to become temporary. Every improvement I made to Elba demonstrated that my capabilities hadn't diminished with my circumstances. Every order I gave with imperial authority reminded everyone, including myself, that titles might be stripped away but character cannot be defeated. But the real key to my psychological survival was intelligence gathering. While my enemies assumed I was neutralized, I maintained extensive correspondence with supporters throughout Europe. I learned that the Congress of Vienna was struggling to reorganize Europe without my unifying influence. I discovered that the restored Bourbon monarchy was already creating the same problems that had led to revolution 25 years earlier. Most importantly, I realized that France was beginning to miss the efficiency, merit, and glory of the empire. Acting as if defeat is temporary requires maintaining the infrastructure of comeback even when comeback seems impossible. I kept my staff functioning as an imperial administration in miniature. I maintained military discipline among my guard. I continued studying maps and planning campaigns that existed only in my imagination. When others saw a fallen emperor going through the motions of past glory, I was actually a future emperor preparing for his return. The decision to leave Elba wasn't born from desperation or fantasy. It was born from careful analysis that revealed the moment when action would transform wishful thinking into realistic possibility. By February 1815, I had concluded that France was ready for my return. Europe was politically unstable, and my enemies were complacent enough to be surprised by decisive action. On February 26, 1815, I sailed from Elba with just over 1,000 men, on a fleet of small boats that any naval force could have destroyed. But I wasn't acting as an exile, attempting a desperate gamblee, was acting as an emperor returning to reclaim what belonged to him. This psychological positioning made all the difference in how events unfolded. When we landed near Cannes, I faced the first test of whether France would accept my return. The local garrison could have arrested me immediately, ending my comeback before it began. Instead, when I walked toward them alone, unarmed, and spoke to them as their emperor, they joined me. Why? Because I acted with such natural authority that opposing me felt like mutiny, while following me felt like duty. This is the crucial principle about comeback from defeat. You must act as if your return is inevitable long before it becomes obvious to others. People will treat you according to how you treat yourself. If you act like someone whose time has passed, others will see you as a relic. If you act like someone whose greatest achievements lie ahead, others will see you as a leader worth following. The march from the coast to Paris became the most extraordinary demonstration of this principle in history. With each town we entered, I faced the same choice: act like a fallen emperor hoping for sympathy, or act like a returning emperor expecting allegiance. I chose the latter, and it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Regiment after regiment, sent to arrest me, instead joined my growing army. General Ney, who had promised King Louis XVIII that he would bring me back to Paris in an iron cage, embraced me in tears and placed his sword at my service. Marshal after marshal, who had accepted positions in the restored monarchy, abandoned their new allegiances to rejoin their true emperor. When I finally reached Paris, I had transformed a force of 1,000 into an army of 200. Without fighting a single battle. The Bourbon king fled during the night, leaving me to enter the palace as if I had never left. I had conquered France not through force, but through the simple act of behaving as if I still belonged there. The 100 days that followed proved that acting as if defeat is temporary can literally make it temporary, but it also taught me that some defeats are designed to be instructive rather than reversible. Waterloo would come, and with it, final exile to St. Helena. But that doesn't diminish the extraordinary lesson of the Elba comeback. No defeat is final until you accept it as final. Even knowing how the story ends, I regret nothing about my return. From Elba, it proved that a man who refuses to accept defeat can achieve the impossible even after losing everything. It demonstrated that acting as if your greatest victory lies ahead of you, rather than behind you, can transform reality in ways that passive acceptance never will. Your own defeats, whatever form they take, are not verdicts on your future, are invitations to discover what you're truly made of when everything external is stripped away. The question isn't whether you'll face moments when everything seems lost. The question is whether you'll act as if those moments are endings or beginnings, because how you answer that question will determine which they become. Victory is not a matter of luck or inspiration, It is a matter of mathematics. Throughout my campaigns, I learned that acting as if success follows precise calculations, rather than hoping it follows passionate effort, transforms you from someone who occasionally wins into someone who wins systematically. The difference between great leaders and legendary conquerors is that legends treat victory as a science, not an art. My training as an artillery officer gave me an advantage that most generals lacked. I understood that warfare, like mathematics, operates according to predictable principles. When you fire a cannon, the trajectory of the cannonball follows laws of physics that don't change based on your emotions, your courage, or your noble intentions. The same mathematical precision that governs artillery can govern every aspect of conquest if you learn to act as if numbers matter more than feelings. At the Battle of Rivoli in 1797, I faced an Austrian force that outnumbered my army nearly 2-1. The conventional approach would have been to rely on superior morale, better tactics, or fortunate circumstances to overcome this numerical disadvantage. Instead, I applied mathematical thinking to transform what appeared to be a hopeless situation into an inevitable victory. I calculated that the Austrian force, while larger overall, could only bring a fraction of their strength to bear at any single point due to the mountainous terrain that channeled their advance. I then positioned my forces to achieve local numerical superiority at the decisive moment. Even though we were outnumbered globally, when the battle was fought, it wasn't courage versus courage or skill versus skill. It was mathematics in action. This is the fundamental insight about mathematical conquest. You don't need to be stronger everywhere if you can be stronger at the right place at the right time. Acting as if you can calculate your way to victory means identifying the precise moment and location where your concentrated effort will produce disproportionate results. But mathematical thinking extends far beyond battlefield tactics. When I reorganized the French educational system, I applied the same quantitative approach. I calculated how many engineers, administrators, and officers the empire would need over the next generation, then designed schools to produce exactly those numbers with the precise skills required. Most leaders hope that education will somehow produce the talent they need. I acted as if I could engineer the exact human resources my empire required. The key to mathematical conquest is understanding that every situation contains measurable variables that determine outcomes. In warfare, these variables include troop strength, artillery pieces, supply lines, terrain advantages, weather conditions, and dozens of other factors that can be quantified and calculated. In any competitive environment, similar variables exist. You just need to train yourself to see them. When I planned the Austerlitz campaign, I spent weeks calculating not just how many troops each side could field, but how far they could march per day, how much ammunition they could carry, how long their supply lines could sustain different rates of combat, and at what point fatigue would degrade their fighting effectiveness. Victory wasn't achieved through superior inspiration. It was achieved through superior mathematics. I maintained detailed records of every unit's performance in every engagement, creating a database that allowed me to predict with remarkable accuracy how different commanders would perform in specific situations. When other generals relied on intuition about their subordinates' capabilities, I relied on statistical analysis of their documented results. This gave me an enormous advantage in assigning the right leaders to the right missions. The mathematical approach also shaped how I thought about risks and opportunities. Instead of asking whether a particular strategy might work, I calculated the probability of success under different scenarios. Instead of hoping that bold action would somehow produce favorable results, I determined the precise conditions under which bold action would mathematically lead to victory. This disciplined thinking became most important when I faced the pressure of making decisions with incomplete information. Every commander faces moments when they must act without knowing everything they would like to know. The difference between mathematical conquerors and intuitive gamblers is that mathematical conquerors can calculate the minimum information required for confident action, while gamblers either wait too long for perfect information or act too quickly on insufficient data. At Janahostedt, I demonstrated how mathematical thinking transforms uncertainty into advantage. Prussian forces had gathered somewhere in the region, but I didn't know their exact positions or intentions. Instead of waiting for perfect intelligence, I calculated that my army's superior mobility would allow me to concentrate faster than they could respond, regardless of where they were positioned. I turned their uncertainty about my vocation into my certainty about the outcome. The mathematics of victory also governs resource allocation. I learned to calculate the exact investment of time, men, and materials required to achieve specific objectives, then to determine whether those objectives were worth their calculated cost. This prevented me from pursuing emotional, satisfying victories that would have weakened my overall position. When I besieged fortified cities, I didn't rely on heroic assaults or extended blockades, calculated the precise amount of artillery required to breach specific sections of wall in predictable time frames. When I planned campaigns, I didn't hope that inspiration would overcome logistical challenges, calculated exactly what supplies, transport, and communication systems would be required to sustain operations at the tempo I intended. This mathematical approach extended to human psychology as well. I calculated how different combinations of rewards, punishments, honors, and opportunities would motivate different types of people. I treated morale, loyalty, and ambition as variables that could be measured and influenced through systematic application of calculated incentives. The Legion of Honor wasn't created as an emotional gesture to reward virtue. It was created as a mathematical tool to produce the precise behaviors that would strengthen the empire. I calculated that public recognition would motivate certain personalities more effectively than monetary rewards, that permanent honors would influence behavior more than temporary privileges, and that merit-based advancement would attract talent more reliably than hereditary systems. But the most important mathematical principle is this: small advantages, consistently applied, produce enormous cumulative results. I didn't win through dramatic gestures or lucky breaks. I won through systematic accumulation of marginal advantages that compounded over time, acting as if small improvements matter more than spectacular efforts means building victory through countless calculated decisions, rather than hoping for decisive moments of inspiration. When you learn to think mathematically about conquest, you stop leaving results to chance and start engineering outcomes through precise application of measurable principles. You stop hoping that passion will overcome preparation and start ensuring that preparation makes passion effective. You stop gambling on inspiration and start calculating your way to inevitable victory. The mathematics of victory isn't about removing human elements from conquest. It's about understanding exactly how human elements can be measured, predicted, and optimized to achieve your objectives. Numbers don't replace courage, they multiply its effectiveness. Calculations don't eliminate risks, they ensure that the risks you take are the right ones. The true measure of leadership isn't how you perform when everything is going according to plan. It's how you lead when facing odds so overwhelming that every rational analysis suggests defeat is inevitable. At the Battle of the Pyramids, I stood before my army knowing we were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and facing warriors who had controlled this land for centuries. Yet I acted as if our victory was so certain that the only question was how quickly we would achieve it. July 21st, 1798. In the shadow of monuments that had witnessed 40 centuries of conquest and defeat, I faced a choice that every leader encounters. In their darkest moments, acknowledge the reality of your desperate situation to your followers, or act with such unshakable confidence that they never doubt the outcome you've already decided is inevitable. The Mamluk cavalry charging toward us represented everything that should have terrified a European army in the Egyptian desert. These warriors had been bred for battle, trained from childhood to fight on horseback, and they knew this terrain as intimately as we knew the streets of Paris. They rode the finest Arabian horses, carried weapons perfected through generations of warfare, and had never been defeated by any foreign army that had dared to invade their homeland. My soldiers saw death approaching at a gallop. I saw an opportunity to demonstrate that disciplined European tactics could defeat traditional Arab warfare. The difference wasn't in our respective capabilities, it was in our respective beliefs about what was about to happen. I formed the army into squares, each regiment creating a fortress of bayonets with artillery at the corners. This wasn't just a tactical decision, it was a psychological statement. By acting as if our defensive formation was impregnable, I was telling my men that we weren't hoping to survive the Mamluk charge, we were preparing to destroy it. But the real leadership challenge wasn't tactical, it was maintaining absolute certainty in front of men who could see with their own eyes how desperate our situation appeared. When you're leading through impossible odds, your followers will take their emotional cues from you. If you show doubt, fear, or uncertainty, those emotions become contagious. If you demonstrate unshakable confidence, that confidence becomes the foundation of their courage. As the Mamluk cavalry thundered toward our squares, I didn't retreat to a safe observation post to watch the battle unfold. I positioned myself where every soldier could see me, acting as if witnessing their victory was more important than protecting my own safety. Leadership through impossible odds requires physical presence at the point of greatest danger, because your willingness to share the risk validates your confidence in the outcome. When the enemy cavalry struck our squares, the clash was everything our tactical calculations had predicted, but the psychological impact exceeded my greatest expectations. The sight of those magnificent horses and riders being shattered against our disciplined firepower didn't just prove our tactical superiority. It demonstrated to every man in our army that European discipline could overcome any form of traditional courage. This is the crucial insight about leading through impossible odds. Your followers need to see dramatic evidence that your confidence was justified before they'll fully trust your leadership in future desperate situations. Every time you lead them through apparent impossibility to actual victory, you're building a psychological reserve of trust that will sustain them through even greater challenges ahead. After the pyramids, my army began to think differently about obstacles. They had personally witnessed what happened when disciplined execution of a well-conceived plan met traditional approaches that relied more on individual courage than collective coordination. They learned to act as if our methods would prevail over any opposition, regardless of how intimidating that opposition initially appeared. But leading through impossible odds requires more than just confidence. It requires the ability to make quick tactical adjustments while maintaining strategic certainty. During the siege of Acre, when our assault columns were repeatedly thrown back from the walls, I had to modify our approach without admitting that our original plan was flawed. Leadership means acting as if every setback is simply information that helps you refine your path to inevitable victory. I rotated assault units to prevent exhaustion from becoming despair. I repositioned artillery to maintain psychological pressure on the defenders while giving our infantry time to regroup. I personally visited wounded soldiers to demonstrate that their sacrifice was advancing our ultimate objective, not just adding to our casualties. Every action was designed to reinforce the message that temporary obstacles weren't changing our fundamental trajectory toward triumph. The key to maintaining morale through impossible odds is helping your followers understand that difficult doesn't mean impossible, and temporary setbacks don't indicate permanent defeat. When you act as if every challenge is simply part of the process that leads to inevitable victory, your people learn to interpret struggles as progress rather than problems. At Wagram, facing the largest army Austria had ever assembled against me, I demonstrated this principle in its purest form. The battle raged for 2 days, with tremendous casualties on both sides, and at several points our situation appeared hopeless. But I never allowed doubt to appear in my voice, my posture, or my orders. I continued to speak about victory as if it was a mathematical certainty rather than a desperate hope. When Marshal Lannes was mortally wounded, when our cavalry charges were repulsed, when enemy artillery inflicted devastating casualties on our infantry, I acted as if these were the expected costs of achieving our predetermined objective. My marshals could see that I wasn't ignoring reality, was interpreting reality through the lens of absolute confidence in our ultimate success. This psychological leadership became self-fulfilling. Because I acted as if victory was inevitable, my commanders continued to look for opportunities to seize advantage rather than preparing for honorable defeat. Because they maintained offensive thinking, they spotted the moment when Austrian morale began to crack. Because they struck immediately when that moment arrived, we transformed apparent stalemate into decisive triumph. Leading through impossible odds also means accepting personal responsibility for outcomes while sharing credit for successes. When things go wrong, your followers need to see that you're taking accountability rather than looking for scapegoats. When things go right, they need to see that you recognize their contributions rather than claiming sole credit. After every major battle, regardless of the outcome, I made it a point to walk among the wounded and speak personally with the units that had carried the heaviest burden. I wanted them to see that their emperor shared their risks and honored their sacrifices. More importantly, I wanted them to understand that their individual efforts were contributing to something larger than any single engagement. The ultimate test of leadership through impossible odds comes when you face not just tactical challenges, but strategic situations where conventional wisdom suggests that your entire cause is doomed. During the 1814 campaign, when coalition armies invaded France from multiple directions and outnumbered my forces by more than 3-1, I demonstrated how acting as if impossible odds are simply complex problems can extend your effectiveness far beyond what anyone thinks possible. I couldn't match the enemy's numbers, but I could match their mobility and exceed their coordination. I acted as if our smaller army was actually an advantage because it could move faster and strike more precisely than their cumbersome coalitions. Instead of trying to defend everything, I chose to attack their separated forces one at a time, using speed and surprise to achieve local superiority despite global disadvantage. This campaign taught me the most important lesson about leading through impossible odds. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies, but proving to yourself and your followers that you can maintain excellence even in defeat. How you lead through impossible odds becomes part of your legacy, regardless of whether those odds ultimately prove surmountable. When you learn to act as if impossible odds are simply opportunities to demonstrate capabilities that comfortable situations never reveal, you develop a form of leadership that inspires absolute loyalty. Your followers learn that following you doesn't guarantee easy victories, but it guarantees that they'll discover what they're truly capable of achieving when properly led toward worthy objectives. Greatness is not achieved through occasional bursts of inspiration. It is built through daily disciplines so consistent that extraordinary results become inevitable. My rise from artillery officer to emperor wasn't the product of lucky breaks or brilliant moments, but the result of acting as if every single day was an opportunity to prepare for the destiny I intended to claim. Most people misunderstand the relationship between discipline and freedom. They think discipline constrains you, that rigid routines limit your potential for greatness. I discovered the opposite. Perfect discipline creates perfect freedom. Because when your daily habits systematically build your capabilities, you become free to seize any opportunity that presents itself. My daily routine during the height of the empire began at 4 a.m. Not because I enjoyed early mornings, but because I had calculated that starting before the rest of the world gave me a 4-hour advantage every single day. While others were sleeping, I was reading dispatches, studying maps, dictating correspondence, and making decisions that would shape the fate of millions. I acted as if those quiet morning hours were the most valuable real estate in my entire empire. Every morning, I began with what I called my mental artillery preparation, a systematic review of every significant issue facing the empire. I read reports from my prefects, analyzed intelligence from across Europe, studied diplomatic correspondence, and reviewed military dispatches. This wasn't passive consumption of information, it was active preparation for the decisions I would need to make throughout the day. I trained myself to absorb vast amounts of information quickly and retain the essential elements while discarding the irrelevant details. Most leaders become overwhelmed by information and either ignore important details or become paralyzed by excessive data. I learned to act as if perfect information processing was a skill that could be developed through daily practice, and that practice made me capable of staying ahead of situations that would have overwhelmed other administrators. After my morning intelligence review, I focused on what I called empire maintenance, the daily administrative decisions that kept the vast machinery of government functioning smoothly. I signed decrees, approved appointments, allocated resources, and resolved disputes that had been escalated from lower levels of administration. I treated these routine matters with the same intensity that I brought to major campaigns because I understood that empires are built through accumulated daily excellence, not sporadic moments of brilliance. But the most important element of my daily discipline was strategic thinking time. Every single day, regardless of immediate pressures or urgent crises, I reserved 2 hours for what I called emperor time. Uninterrupted focus on long-term planning, systematic analysis of major challenges, and careful consideration of how current decisions would affect future possibilities. During these sessions, I acted as if I could see 5 years into the future and worked backward to determine what actions today would make my vision inevitable. I studied maps not just of current territories, but of regions I intended to influence. I analyzed not just current enemies, but potential future threats. I planned not just immediate campaigns, but the sequence of victories that would establish permanent advantages. This forward-thinking discipline gave me an enormous advantage over leaders who spent their days reacting to immediate pressures. While they were managing current crises, I was preventing future ones. While they were responding to their enemies' initiatives, I was creating initiatives that would force my enemies to respond to me. While they were hoping for favorable circumstances, I was systematically creating circumstances that would favor my objectives. Physical discipline was equally important to mental discipline. I maintained rigorous exercise routines even during the most demanding campaigns, not because I enjoyed physical exertion, but because I had learned that mental sharpness depends on physical conditioning. I acted as if my body was a tool that required daily maintenance to perform at the level my responsibilities demanded. I also disciplined my consumption habits with mathematical precision. I ate specific foods at specific times to maintain consistent energy levels throughout my 8 workdays. I controlled my sleep schedule to maximize mental clarity during the hours when important decisions were most likely to be required. I treated my physical condition as seriously as I treated military logistics because I understood that Personal discipline creates the foundation for professional excellence. The discipline that others found most difficult to understand was my approach to social interactions. I allocated specific time periods for specific types of conversations, and I refused to allow casual social obligations to interfere with systematic productivity. This wasn't rudeness, it was recognition that time spent on activities that don't advance your primary objectives is time stolen from activities that could transform your life. When people complained that I was too focused on work and not sufficiently interested in pleasures, I explained that my greatest pleasure came from the systematic achievement of objectives that others considered impossible. I had trained myself to find satisfaction in daily progress toward long-term goals rather than an immediate gratification that provided no lasting benefit. This discipline extended to how I managed information and decision-making. I established specific protocols for how different types of issues would be researched, analyzed, and resolved. I created systematic approaches for evaluating subordinates, allocating resources, and measuring results. I acted as if random approaches to important matters were forms of self-sabotage, and systematic approaches were forms of self-multiplication. The compound effect of daily discipline became most apparent during crises when quick decisions with enormous consequences were required. Because I had been practicing rapid analysis and decisive action every single day for years, I could maintain clarity and confidence even when facing completely unprecedented situations. My daily preparation had created an enormous reserve of decision-making capability that I could draw upon when circumstances demanded peak performance. During the invasion of Russia, when everything that could go wrong was going wrong, my daily disciplines became the foundation that prevented complete psychological collapse. While my marshals were overwhelmed by the scale of our difficulties, I continued to maintain my systematic approach to information gathering, strategic analysis, and resource allocation. I acted as if discipline during disaster was even more important than discipline during success. This taught me the most important lesson about daily discipline. It's not what you do when you feel motivated that determines your destiny. It's what you do when you feel defeated. Anyone can maintain good habits when things are going well. Conquerors maintain excellent habits, especially when circumstances make excellence difficult. The conqueror's daily discipline isn't about perfection, it's about consistency. You don't need to execute every element of your routine flawlessly every single day. You need to execute your routine well enough, consistently enough, that your capabilities systematically improve over time. Small daily improvements, maintained over months and years, produce results that appear miraculous to people who don't understand the mathematics of consistent effort. When you learn to act as if every day is preparation for the most important opportunity of your life, you begin to live with an intensity that transforms ordinary activities into extraordinary preparation. You stop wasting time on activities that don't advance your primary objectives. You start investing time in capabilities that will multiply your effectiveness when decisive moments arrive. The daily disciplines that built my empire can build your empire, whatever form that empire takes. The question isn't whether you have time for systematic daily improvement. The question is whether you can afford not to develop the disciplines that will make your greatest ambitions inevitable rather than merely possible. There comes a moment in every conqueror's rise when success itself becomes the greatest obstacle to continued success. By 1813, I had achieved everything I had dreamed of and more. Emperor of France, master of Europe, architect of a new continental order. But with those achievements came something I hadn't anticipated: the united opposition of every major power in the world, determined to destroy me before I could remake civilization entirely according to my vision. The Sixth Coalition represented something unprecedented in European history. Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and dozens of smaller nations had put aside centuries of mutual rivalry to focus on a single objective: the complete destruction of Napoleon Bonaparte and everything he represented. They had learned that defeating me individually was impossible, so they had chosen to act as if coordinated, overwhelming force was the only solution to the problem I presented. Standing against this united opposition, I faced the ultimate test of conquest psychology. How do you maintain offensive thinking when literally the entire world has organized itself around your destruction? How do you act as if victory is still possible when every rational analysis suggests that the odds have finally become truly insurmountable? The conventional response would have been to seek negotiated settlement, to trade territories for peace, to accept that my expansion had reached its natural limits. The coalition offered me terms that would have preserved France within its natural borders, while requiring me to abandon my imperial ambitions. Many of my advisors urged me to accept these terms as the best possible outcome given our circumstances. But I had spent too many years acting as if impossible odds were simply complex problems to start accepting limitations now. I looked at the map of coalition forces surrounding France and saw not insurmountable opposition, but the greatest opportunity of my career, the chance to prove that one nation, properly organized and led, could defeat the combined might of the old European order. This is the crucial mindset for facing united opposition. Instead of asking, "How can I survive this?" you must ask, "How can I use this to demonstrate capabilities they never suspected I possessed?" When the entire world unites against you, you're not facing your greatest crisis, you're facing your greatest opportunity to prove that individual excellence can overcome collective mediocrity. I began the 1813 campaign by acting as if the coalition's numerical superiority was actually a disadvantage for them. Large coalitions suffer from coordination problems that smaller, more unified forces can exploit. Multiple commanders with different objectives, competing national interests, complex communication requirements, and the need for consensus decision-making, all of these factors slow down coalition responses and create opportunities for rapid, decisive action. At Lutzen and Bautzen, I demonstrated that acting as if coalition advantages were coalition weaknesses could produce spectacular results. While my enemies struggled to coordinate their massive armies, I concentrated my forces and struck with the speed and precision that had made me famous. I achieved tactical victories that reminded everyone, including myself, that superior leadership could still overcome superior numbers, but fighting the entire world simultaneously taught me something deeper about opposition. The moment you've become so successful that everyone unites against you, you've actually won the most important victory possible. You've proven that your individual capabilities represent a threat to the entire existing order. You've forced your enemies to admit that normal competition isn't sufficient to contain you. When Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria formed the core of the coalition, they were acknowledging that Napoleon Bonaparte had become more powerful than any single European nation. When they convinced dozens of smaller states to join their alliance, they were admitting that ordinary diplomatic and military pressure wouldn't be enough to stop my continued expansion. Their unity wasn't evidence of my weakness, it was evidence of my strength. This realization transformed how I approached the campaign psychologically. Instead of seeing myself as one nation fighting desperately against overwhelming odds, I began to see myself as the representative of a new principle, merit-based leadership, fighting against the old principle of hereditary privilege. The coalition wasn't just trying to defeat France. They were trying to prevent the spread of ideas that threatened their entire system of social organization. At Dresden, I achieved perhaps my most satisfying victory of the entire period. Coalition forces had gathered what they thought was sufficient strength to crush my army decisively. Instead, I demonstrated that superior tactics and inspired leadership could still overcome massive numerical superiority. The psychological impact of this victory was enormous. It proved that even when fighting the entire world, I could still achieve the kind of spectacular triumph that had made my reputation. But the real lesson of fighting united opposition is that survival itself becomes a form of victory. Every day that you maintain your position while the entire world is organized around your destruction proves that you possess capabilities your enemies don't understand. Every month that you continue to threaten their interests while they're applying maximum pressure demonstrates that their maximum effort isn't sufficient to stop you. The coalition learned this lesson slowly and painfully. Their initial assumption was that massive force applied consistently would achieve rapid victory. When I continued to win individual battles and maintain French territorial integrity despite their overwhelming superiority, they began to realize they were facing something unprecedented, a leader who became more dangerous, not less dangerous. When faced with impossible odds, this forced them to escalate their commitment far beyond what they had originally planned. Resources that were supposed to achieve quick victory had to be sustained for extended campaign seasons. Armies that were supposed to overwhelm me through size discovered they needed better training and leadership to compete with French tactical superiority. Coalition strategies that looked simple on paper became extraordinarily complex and expensive in practice. By late 1813, I had achieved something remarkable. While facing the united opposition of the entire European continent, I had forced them to invest so heavily in their anti-Napoleon coalition that they were weakening themselves in other areas of competition. Britain was spending unsustainable amounts on subsidies to coalition partners. Russia was extending its military commitments far beyond its natural interests. Prussia and Austria were discovering that coalition warfare required sacrifices of sovereignty they hadn't anticipated. When you learn to act as if united opposition is validation rather than threat, you develop a form of psychological immunity to intimidation. Instead of being overwhelmed by the scale of resistance you're facing, you become energized by the evidence that you've become important enough to require their coordinated attention. Instead of seeking to avoid such opposition, you begin to seek opportunities to demonstrate that even coordinated resistance isn't sufficient to contain your capabilities. The ultimate defeat at Leipzig in October 1813 didn't invalidate the lessons of fighting united opposition, it confirmed them. The coalition required nearly 400,000 troops from 6 different nations, fighting in perfect coordination to achieve decisive victory over my 190,000 men. Even in defeat, I had forced them to demonstrate that defeating Napoleon Bonaparte required literally the entire resources of European civilization applied simultaneously. More importantly, the coalition's victory taught them something they hadn't expected. Eliminating me wouldn't eliminate the ideas I represented. Merit-based advancement, systematic governance, legal equality, and efficient administration couldn't be defeated on battlefields because they weren't military concepts. They were organizational principles that produced superior results regardless of who implemented them. When the world unites against you, you discover whether you represent temporary threat or permanent transformation. Temporary threats can be defeated through sufficient force. Permanent transformations require that your enemies adopt your methods in order to compete with you effectively. The greatest victory isn't surviving united opposition. It's forcing that opposition to become more like you in order to defeat you. By 1814, the coalition armies that finally invaded France had been transformed by their struggle against me. They had adopted French-style rapid movement, concentrated artillery, merit-based promotion, and systematic logistics. They had learned to fight like I fought because fighting any other way had proven insufficient. In destroying my empire, they had validated my methods by making them universal. This is the ultimate lesson of facing united opposition. When you act as if your principles are worth defending against any odds, You force the world to either adopt those principles or admit that inferior methods are sufficient for their purposes. Either outcome represents a form of victory that transcends any individual campaign or personal defeat. June 18th, 1815, was the day I learned that even conquerors must eventually face the one obstacle that cannot be overcome through will, strategy, or determination alone. Waterloo taught me that acting as if every obstacle can be conquered doesn't mean every obstacle will be conquered, but it does mean that how you face inevitable defeat determines whether that defeat destroys you or teaches you the final lesson. Every great leader must learn. Standing on the field at Waterloo, watching my Imperial Guard retreat for the first time in their legendary history, I confronted something I had spent 20 years refusing to accept. There are moments when all your experience, all your capabilities, and all your determination converge on an outcome that you cannot control. This wasn't military defeat, this was cosmic instruction in the limits of human will. The campaign had begun with every reason for confidence. I had returned from Elba to reclaim my throne, rallied France to my cause, and assembled an army that combined veteran experience with revolutionary enthusiasm. The coalition forces were scattered and uncoordinated. The strategic situation offered clear opportunities for the kind of rapid, decisive action that had characterized my greatest victories. I had every justification for acting as if this campaign would restore the empire and vindicate my return. But Waterloo revealed something about obstacles that I had never fully understood. Sometimes the greatest barriers to victory aren't external enemies or unfavorable circumstances. They're the accumulated weight of years spent pushing human capabilities beyond their sustainable limits. My body, my judgment, and my army were all carrying burdens that 20 years of constant warfare had imposed. The morning of June 18th, I awoke feeling the effects of the stomach ailment that had been plaguing me for months. My usual mental clarity was clouded, my customary energy was diminished, and my legendary ability to make rapid decisions under pressure was compromised. I had spent my entire career acting as if physical limitations couldn't constrain mental performance, but nature was finally demanding payment for decades of ignored health warnings. More significantly, I was leading an army that was exhausted, not just from recent campaigns, but from the cumulative stress of 2 decades spent conquering Europe. These weren't the energetic young soldiers who had followed me across the Alps or through the Egyptian desert. These were veterans who had given everything they had to give, who had endured every hardship that warfare could impose, and who were approaching the end of their capacity for superhuman effort. Yet even recognizing these limitations, I chose to act as if one final demonstration of imperial excellence could overcome whatever obstacles remained. I deployed my forces according to principles that had never failed me, concentrated my artillery as I had done at Austerlitz, and prepared to execute the kind of devastating attack that had crushed Austrian, Prussian, and Russian armies throughout my career. The first hours of battle seemed to confirm that my methods remained superior. We broke through Wellington's lines at Hougoumont. We dominated the center of the battlefield with our artillery, and we forced the British forces back from several key positions. For most of the day, Waterloo looked like it would become another in the long series of victories that had established my reputation as the master of European warfare. But then something unprecedented happened. Success wasn't sufficient. Breaking Wellington's lines didn't lead to collapsed British resistance. Dominating the battlefield didn't force enemy surrender. Tactical superiority didn't translate into strategic victory. I was discovering that some obstacles resist conquest, not because they're too strong, but because they're part of a larger pattern that your individual will cannot alter. The arrival of Blucher's Prussian army in the late afternoon represented more than tactical reinforcement. It represented the mathematical reality that Europe had finally learned to coordinate its resistance so effectively that even perfect execution of proven methods wouldn't be enough. I was facing not just British and Prussian soldiers, but the accumulated strategic learning of every nation that had fought against me for 20 years. When I ordered the final charge of the Imperial Guard, I wasn't acting out of desperation or denial. I was making a conscious choice to demonstrate that some principles are worth upholding even when victory is no longer possible. The Guard had never retreated in battle, and I chose to act as if maintaining that record was more important than preserving their lives for a future that might never come. Watching them advance across that muddied field toward impossible odds, I realized I was witnessing something more significant than military tactics. I was seeing the highest expression of human courage, the willingness to act according to your deepest principles, even when those principles can no longer guarantee the outcomes you desire. When the Guard broke and began their first retreat in history, I faced the moment that every conqueror must eventually face, the recognition that your individual will, no matter how powerful, operates within limits that you cannot transcend through determination alone. This wasn't failure of leadership, this was instruction in the cosmic boundaries that contained all human ambition. The immediate aftermath of Waterloo revealed the true test of character that defeat provides. I could have spent my remaining years blaming circumstances, subordinates, or bad luck for the outcome. Instead, I chose to act as if this defeat was the final lesson in a curriculum that had been teaching me about power, leadership, and human limitations throughout my entire career. In my subsequent reflections on St. Helena, I came to understand that Waterloo hadn't invalidated everything I had learned about conquering obstacles. It had completed my education by showing me the one obstacle that makes all other obstacles meaningful, the certainty that every human story ends in defeat by forces larger than individual will. This recognition didn't diminish the value of acting as if obstacles can be conquered. It enhanced that value by providing context. When you know that ultimate defeat is inevitable, every temporary victory becomes more precious. When you understand that your time is limited, every moment spent overcoming challenges becomes an investment in meaning rather than just achievement. The soldiers who died at Waterloo, the empire that ended at Waterloo, and the dreams that were shattered at Waterloo all served a purpose larger than their immediate objectives. They proved that humans can choose to act with dignity and excellence even when facing impossible odds, even when pursuing objectives that cannot be achieved, even when defending principles that cannot be sustained indefinitely. Waterloo taught me that the ultimate conquest isn't defeating every obstacle you encounter, it's maintaining your commitment to excellence, regardless of whether that excellence produces the outcomes you originally sought. Some battles are worth fighting not because you can win them, but because fighting them demonstrates what you value more than victory itself. When you truly understand this lesson, you stop measuring success only by whether you overcome obstacles, and start measuring it by how well you respond to obstacles that cannot be overcome. You stop acting as if conquest means never facing defeat, and start acting as if conquest means maintaining your principles, especially when defeat becomes inevitable. The morning after Waterloo, as I prepared for abdication and exile, I felt neither shame nor regret about the choices that had led to this outcome. I had spent 20 years proving that acting as if any obstacle could be conquered would enable me to conquer obstacles that others considered impossible. Waterloo didn't disprove this principle, it simply reminded me that the most important victory isn't over external enemies, but over the internal temptation to compromise your standards when facing circumstances you cannot control. From my final exile on St. Helena, watching the sun set over an ocean that now separated me forever from the empire I had built, I realized that the principles I had learned about conquering obstacles would outlive the specific conquests they had enabled. The techniques that had transformed a Corsican artillery officer into Emperor of Europe weren't dependent on 18th century battlefields or 19th century politics. They were universal principles that would apply to any era, any challenge, and any person willing to act as if greatness was their natural destiny. 2 centuries have passed since I walked the earth, yet the obstacles facing human ambition remain fundamentally unchanged. The details are different. Your battlefields are boardrooms. Your enemies are competitors. Your territories are markets. Your alliances are partnerships. But the essential challenge remains identical. How do you overcome resistance, achieve objectives that others consider impossible, and build something lasting from the raw materials of determination and intelligence? The first principle that transcends all eras is this: obstacles reveal character, they don't create it. Every significant challenge you face will test whether you've developed the internal resources necessary to persist when persistence becomes difficult. The person you become while overcoming obstacles is more important than the specific obstacles you overcome, because that person will determine how you respond to every future challenge. In my time, I faced the obstacle of aristocratic privilege, blocking advancement based on merit. In your time, you face obstacles like economic uncertainty, technological disruption, intense competition, and social instability. But the fundamental approach remains the same. You must act as if your capabilities matter more than your circumstances, as if your determination can overcome systemic resistance, and as if creating value will eventually be recognized regardless of current barriers. The second principle is that conquest psychology remains more powerful than conquest tactics. How you think about challenges determines what you're able to accomplish more than what specific methods you employ. I succeeded not because I had access to superior weapons or larger armies, but because I had trained myself to think like someone for whom victory was inevitable rather than someone for whom victory was hoped for. This mindset transformation is available to anyone in any era. You can choose to approach your career as someone who hopes for recognition, or as someone who acts with such competence that recognition becomes inevitable. You can tackle your business challenges as someone who wishes for favorable conditions, or as someone who creates favorable conditions through systematic excellence. You can face personal obstacles as someone who waits for circumstances to improve, or as someone who improves circumstances through determined action. The third principle is that systematic approaches defeat sporadic efforts, regardless of how intense those sporadic efforts might be. My empire wasn't built through occasional bursts of inspiration. It was built through daily disciplines that accumulated into extraordinary capabilities over time. The code, Napoleon, the university system, the road network, and the administrative reforms all represented systematic solutions to systematic problems. In your modern context, this means that consistent daily improvement will overcome dramatic but inconsistent efforts. Building wealth happens through systematic saving and investing, not through hoping for lucky breaks. Developing expertise happens through systematic practice and study, not through waiting for natural talent to manifest. Creating valuable relationships happens through systematic attention to others' needs, not through hoping that charm will compensate for inconsistent behavior. The fourth principle is that leadership begins with leading yourself, and self-leadership begins with acting as if you deserve the respect you seek from others. I commanded loyalty from my soldiers, not by demanding it, but by demonstrating that following me led to achievements they couldn't accomplish independently. I earned respect from other rulers, not by claiming it, but by proving that my methods produced results superior to theirs. This remains the foundation of all influence. You must become the kind of person others naturally want to follow before you can effectively lead them toward objectives they wouldn't pursue on their own. Whether you're managing a team, building a business, or raising a family, your authority comes from demonstrated competence, combined with genuine concern for others' success. The fifth principle is that timing matters more than strength, and timing can be created rather than simply awaited. My greatest victories came not from having larger armies, but from concentrating my forces at the decisive point, at the decisive moment. I learned to engineer circumstances so that when I finally acted, success appeared inevitable to everyone. Watching in competitive modern environments, this translates into positioning yourself to take advantage of opportunities that others can't see or won't pursue. Instead of trying to overpower your competition through superior resources, you focus on identifying moments when your specific capabilities can produce disproportionate results. You learn to prepare for opportunities that don't yet exist, so that when they appear, you're the only person ready to seize them. The sixth principle is that setbacks are information, not verdicts. Every defeat I suffered taught me something valuable about my methods, my opponents, or my assumptions. Waterloo wasn't the end of my story, was the completion of my education, about the limits within which human ambition must operate. Understanding those limits didn't diminish my achievements. It provided context that made those achievements more meaningful. Your failures and setbacks serve the same function. They provide feedback about what isn't working so you can adjust your approach before investing more time in ineffective methods. The key is learning to interpret temporary defeats as temporary rather than permanent, as instructive rather than conclusive, and as preparation for future success rather than evidence of inherent limitation. The seventh principle is that acting as if your vision is inevitable creates the conditions that make it inevitable. When I placed the crown on my own head, I wasn't pretending to be emperor, was acknowledging the reality that my actions had already created. The ceremony simply made visible what had already become true through years of acting with imperial authority. This principle applies to any significant goal you're pursuing. When you start acting as if your success is inevitable, you begin making decisions that make success more likely. You invest in long-term capabilities rather than seeking short-term gratification. You build relationships based on mutual value creation rather than immediate personal benefit. You develop systematic approaches to important challenges rather than hoping that inspiration will somehow produce the results you need. The most important principle, which I learned only after losing everything at Waterloo, is that the ultimate conquest is internal rather than external. The person you become while pursuing ambitious objectives is more valuable than any specific objective you achieve. The capabilities you develop while overcoming obstacles will serve you in situations you cannot currently imagine. The character you build while maintaining excellence under pressure will determine how you respond to every future challenge and opportunity. To centuries after my death, I am remembered not primarily for the territories I conquered or the battles I won, but for the demonstration that individual excellence can achieve results that previously seemed impossible. The empire is gone, but the example remains. One person, acting as if greatness was their natural destiny, can reshape the world around them through systematic application of superior principles. Your opportunity is the same as mine was, to prove that human will, properly focused and consistently applied, can overcome obstacles that intimidate others into accepting less than their potential. The tools available to you are superior to anything I possessed. The opportunities in your era are greater than anything my generation could have imagined. The only question is whether you're willing to act as if conquering any obstacle is not just possible, but inevitable. Given sufficient determination and systematic effort, here we stand together at the end of our journey through the principles that transformed an unknown Corsican into the master of Europe. But this isn't truly an ending, it's the moment when you must choose whether these insights will remain interesting historical observations or become the foundation for your own conquest of whatever obstacles currently stand between you and your greatest ambitions. I have shared with you everything I learned about acting as if any obstacle can be conquered, because I recognize in your struggles the same fundamental challenge I faced, the gap between what you're capable of achieving and what you're currently achieving. That gap exists not because you lack talent, opportunity, or resources. It exists because you haven't yet learned to act, as if closing that gap is inevitable rather than merely possible. Right now, as you absorb these words, you're facing obstacles that seem substantial, perhaps insurmountable. Maybe it's a career plateau that has persisted despite your best efforts. Maybe it's a business challenge that requires capabilities you're not certain you possess. Maybe it's a personal goal that demands changes you're not confident you can sustain. Whatever form your obstacles take, they share one crucial characteristic. They're testing whether you'll act like someone who conquers challenges or someone who is conquered by them. The choice you make in the next 24 hours will determine which category you belong to, not the choice you make eventually when conditions improve or inspiration strikes, but the choice you make immediately. While the principles I've shared are still fresh in your mind and the examples I've provided still resonate with your ambition, your first test is simple but profound. Identify the single most important obstacle currently limiting your progress toward your most significant goal. Not the most dramatic obstacle, not the most recent obstacle, but the one whose removal would have the greatest positive impact on your trajectory. Write it down, look at it, then begin acting as if overcoming this obstacle is not a matter of whether, but when. This shift from hoping to expecting, from trying to knowing, from wishing to planning, this is where conquest begins. Every great achievement in history started with someone deciding that what appeared impossible to others was simply difficult for them. Your personal empire begins the moment you stop accepting your current limitations as permanent features of your reality. The second test requires more courage. You must begin acting with the authority and competence you intend to possess after you've overcome your primary obstacle. If your goal is career advancement, start making decisions and taking actions as someone who has already earned that advancement. If your objective is business success, begin conducting yourself as someone whose success is already established. If your aim is personal transformation, start living as if that transformation has already occurred. This isn't pretending or self-deception. This is strategic psychology. When you act as if you've already achieved what you're working toward, you begin making choices that make that achievement more likely. You invest in long-term capabilities rather than seeking short-term comfort. You build relationships based on mutual value creation rather than personal neediness. You approach challenges as problems to be solved rather than barriers to be endured. But remember, acting as if conquest is inevitable requires backing that attitude with systematic effort worthy of the results you expect. My empire wasn't built through positive thinking alone. It was built through positive thinking combined with 18-hour days, mathematical precision in planning, and relentless execution of systematic strategies. Your empire will require the same combination of psychological confidence and practical excellence. The third test is the most demanding. You must maintain this conquest mindset, especially when circumstances make it difficult. Anyone can act confident when everything is going well. Conquerors act confident when facing setbacks, criticism, and apparent evidence that their methods aren't working. The moments when you're most tempted to abandon your systematic approach are precisely the moments when maintaining it will produce the greatest long-term benefits. I want you to understand something about the journey you're beginning. It will not be easy, comfortable, or quickly completed. Conquering significant obstacles requires sustained effort over extended periods, and that effort will test every aspect of your character. You will face moments when returning to your old limitations seems more attractive than continuing to pursue your new possibilities. But I also want you to understand something about the destination. The person you become while conquering obstacles is more valuable than any specific obstacle you overcome. The capabilities you develop, the character you build, and the confidence you earn through systematic achievement will serve you in situations you cannot currently imagine. You're not just working toward a particular goal, you're becoming the kind of person who achieves ambitious goals consistently. This transformation cannot be rushed, delegated, or achieved through shortcuts. It requires daily discipline, systematic thinking, and persistent action maintained even when those actions don't seem to be producing immediate results. But here's what I can promise you, based on my own experience. If you truly commit to acting as if any obstacle can be conquered, you will discover capabilities within yourself that you never suspected existed. The world needs more conquerors, conquerors of nations and territories, but conquerors of the artificial limitations that prevent human potential from being fully realized. Every obstacle you overcome makes it easier for others to overcome similar obstacles. Every limitation you transcend expands what's considered possible for everyone who observes your example, your personal empire, whether it takes the form of career, achievement, business success, creative accomplishment, or any other worthy objective, is not just about your individual satisfaction. It's about demonstrating that systematic excellence can overcome systematic opposition, that individual determination can prevail against collective resistance, and that acting as if greatness is your natural destiny can make greatness your actual destiny. The principles I've shared with you have guided conquerors throughout history, and they will guide conquerors throughout the future. The only variable is whether you'll choose to apply them with the same intensity and consistency that separated me from my contemporaries. The obstacles you face today are different from mine, but the mindset required to overcome them remains identical. Conquered Europe by refusing to accept that a Corsican outsider couldn't reshape continental civilization. You can conquer whatever stands between you and your greatest ambitions by refusing to accept that your current circumstances define your permanent possibilities. The choice is yours. The moment is now, and your personal empire awaits your decision to claim it. Begin today. Begin with the next decision you make. Begin by acting as if the obstacle that has been limiting your progress is about to discover what happens when it encounters someone who has learned to think like a conqueror. Your destiny is not determined by what has happened to you, it's determined by what you choose to do with what has happened to you. Act accordingly, and watch the world reshape itself around your determination. Viv l'imperalong, live the emperor within you.